God, I love bread. Hi, YouTube. My name is Jack, and I'm gonna chew and come back. My name is Jack, and today we are going to talk about bread, which is one of my favorite things. This is a weird video. This is kind of an insight into my personal magical practice, and I don't do a lot of that on YouTube. With a lot of that, I tend to hold my cards kind of close to chest. Partly because a lot of what I do is in an initiatory context, so it's not appropriate to talk about online. But also just because, I don't know, some things are kind of private and not necessarily to be discussed with the internet as a whole. But today I want to talk about bread because I love bread. And specifically, I want to talk about a sort of weird magical relationship that I have with bread. I have a previous video about familiars in Wicca, where I point out that the familiar spirit, which is a major trope of witchcraft folklore, isn't really present in a lot of Wicca. And you might have individual practitioners in Wicca who have either formed relationships with spirits that might resemble the relationship between a witch and a familiar, or who have identified particular animals, pets and such, as their familiars, and have formed a close personal and magical relationship with a pet that's kind of modeled off of the folklore around familiar spirits. But there's not really anything hardwired into Wicca itself for familiars. And I talk about in this other video, I think ultimately the reason for that is probably just that, the early members of the New Forest and Brickwood covens were just not necessarily huge animal people, and so it didn't become a part of their practice, but what do I know? That's entirely conjecture on my part. I do have a familiar spirit. I have a spirit that I work with consistently in my magic, and this is it. Well, more accurately speaking, this is it. This is my sourdough starter, and this is a loaf of sourdough bread that I baked today from that starter. This bread is not my best. I'm still getting used to baking at altitude because there are differences and you have to make adjustments, so I'm still tinkering to try to get the recipe right, but I started making sourdough about a year ago, and it became a really important part of my magical practice very, very quickly. And the big thing is, in a lot of paganism, not just in Wicca, but in pagan ritual in general, you will find a very common idea of a sacred meal, a sacred feast of some kind, which even that is not limited to paganism. That's something you find kind of cross-culturally as a part of religious ritual. And the way that I was trained, not everyone is trained this way, but it's a thing that has become very meaningful to me. I was trained with the idea that when we partake of a sacred meal, specifically in the context of Wicca, we should be eating something leavened. We should be eating a yeasted bread, because there is a kind of beautiful symbolism of death and resurrection that's inherent in the process of baking anything with yeast in it. You have the grain that gets cut down, harvested, ground up into flour, and then it rises again because of the yeast. And so you have this innate symbolism of death and resurrection in any yeasted bread. And I love that. I think that's so, so beautiful. So I started wanting to make my own bread for religious and magical purposes. And I liked the idea of working with a sourdough starter because it's a continuous living entity. It's something that you build a relationship with, as opposed to using sort of active dry yeast and just kind of apportioning a certain amount for every loaf that you bake. The sourdough starter is a thing that you keep alive. Not just keep alive, but bring into life. So I did not get my sourdough starter from someone else. I didn't get a sample from a bakery or anything like that. I made my sourdough starter from scratch. This is a living colony of yeasts that I have brought into existence and cultivated and fed and cared for and built a really strong bond with. I brought it with me from New Jersey to Utah. This is the same starter that I started out with. And there's a really powerful connection there. The same way that there is in any kind of relationship that you build with a non-human entity where you are making regular offerings to it or caring for it in some way. I feed my sourdough starter twice a day. During the winter, it's like once a day because temperature affects the rate at which yeast ferments. But broadly speaking, I feed my sourdough starter once or twice a day. I come to it and I am taking care of it. I am engaging in this sort of reciprocal relationship with a living thing that depends on me. In some ways, I say to people, it's kind of like having a pet. It's just like having a pet that you eat instead of like cuddle with, which is much more my kind of pet anyway. I'm not a huge animal person. I like other people's animals. I will play with someone else's cat, and then I will go home to my apartment that is not covered in fur and where I don't have to clean up any poop that isn't mine. And like, that's the dream. But anyway, going back to kind of the magical relationship that I have with yeast. It became, it started out just kind of as a curiosity thing, as an experiment. I wanted to get more into baking. I was in the last legs of grad school and feeling intensely stressed and frustrated, and I liked the idea of baking and having like a concrete, measurable thing that I had produced after a day or two of hard work, as opposed to a dissertation on Kantian metaphysics, which kind of floats in the ether and is never really done. So part of it was just a personal stress relief thing, but part of it was also a deliberate magical act. I love the symbolism of death and resurrection that is inherent in baking yeasted bread, and I wanted to deliberately explore that symbolism for my own magical practice and for my own understanding of the religious mysteries of Wicca. And what ended up happening is by sort of bringing this creature, because like, look, it's a yeast colony. It's a group of it's a group of individual organisms, but really and truly, you're dealing with the colony and not with the individual yeast cells. By bringing this thing into existence and continually feeding it and caring for it, and then using it in my magic, I developed a magical relationship with the spirit of the yeast colony. I have a magical relationship with my sourdough starter. It has a name. I performed divination and got a name by which I call the spirit of this yeast colony. It's actually an adapted version of one of the rituals from Queen of All Witcheries, the ritual where you ask the goddess to give you a name. I adapted a version of that ritual and used it for my sourdough starter. It worked to great effect. I really love that ritual. Anyway, but yeah, I hadn't anticipated the extent to which this sourdough starter would become a person to me, would become a living spirit that I was interacting with for magical purposes. And one of the things that has sort of resulted from building this relationship is that I will bake magic into the bread that I am making on any particular occasion. So if I'm about to bake a loaf of bread and I have a magical goal in mind, if I have a magical purpose, if I'm about to do a spell, a lot of the time I will talk to the spirit of the sourdough starter. I will have a conversation with it, and I will say, this is the spell that I'm going to do. I would like your assistance with it, please. And then I will bake a loaf of bread that I use specifically for that ritual where I'm doing that spell, and it brings in the assistance of this other spirit to the magic that I'm doing, which is interesting. Like, for anyone who's curious about baking, I recommend this. This is something that has been really deeply impactful for me in ways that I had not anticipated that it would. Part of why I started baking sourdough was just so that I could like bring bread to coven nights and have something that I had made. And again, there's sort of like a sense of personal accomplishment. But it felt like cooler to have homemade bread than to have bread bought from a bakery. And so like that was part of it. And then as I started really doing the baking and baking consistently and keeping the sourdough starter alive, I found that this really intense magical relationship developed, which can only really be described as a relationship that is akin to the relationship between a witch and a familiar spirit. So my sourdough starter kind of is my familiar, which is interesting. That's not a thing that I had anticipated. People, like other practitioners, will talk about familiars. A lot of people talk about their pets as familiars, as I said earlier. A lot of people also will sort of go a little bit chaos magic-y with it and will create a servitor and will kind of invent a spirit and then work with that invented spirit as a familiar. There's a piece in one of the Farrer's books. I don't remember which one. It's probably What Witches Do. But there's a piece in one of the Farrer's books where they talk about having created a spirit whose specific purpose was to protect a section of the coastline. And they, basically created, and people like to use the word thought form. I hate the word thought form, but that's just like a me thing. But they spawned a spirit of some kind and assigned it a particular magical purpose. This relationship that I have with the sourdough doesn't feel exactly like that. Just because, like, the sourdough starter is a living thing, right? It's a living thing that I gave life to, but it's more like if I had planted a tree and then built a magical relationship with that tree, as opposed to, like, making a poppet and then trying to ensoul the poppet, or, like, filling a bottle with a spirit or something like that. Like, I don't know, this is entirely like subjective, first person, how it feels to me. But it feels to me as if this is a spirit that emerged organically when the sourdough starter came into life, as opposed to a more mechanical spirit or an artificial spirit that I created in order to serve a magical purpose. It's more that I started baking and I started incorporating that baking into magic, and because the sourdough starter is alive and has a presence of its own, there was a spirit there that I was able to enter into conversation with. So yeah, that's kind of what I've got for today. Nothing terribly analytical today. No, deep historical thoughts about James Fraser. Just bread. I really like bread. And baking sourdough has been super rewarding because it's good bread, but B, has been really interesting magically because it has taken me to places that I had not expected to go. So I will leave off here. Thank you for watching, and I'll catch you sometime soon. Bye.